What? I
want chocolate
I don't know, I
wafers.
didn't draw that.
Would anyone else like a chocolate
Pretty
wafer?
sick lizard, if you ask me.
It tastes so chocolate
What do you think about this?
My dad really likes it. So chocolate wafers. These are quite chocolate wafer snacks.
I mean, that's what I asked.
Oh, this is snacks that we packed yesterday.
They're really good.
Somebody if you're a hunter, give me one.
It has film for like the head.
Skinny.
I love them. I don't know.
Oh my gosh, Will.
No way.
Will, take a walk and go.
So-
Oh my god.
I just said I run really fast.
The rarity.
We just said we didn't like
Wait, looks like my greatest hair for the game tomorrow. He's gonna get bad grades. Yes.
I love
I don't think my chocolate wafer is warranty boy, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's like you're not even part of the grouping.
My hair, I would be lying about long.
Looks like you're mean to me.
What did you just say?
You know why?
Will, what did you just say?
I don't know, what are you doing?
In our lab?
Lily, you and Will are kind of like 20.
I just do it on my phone.
Got it, good.
Is your laundry in the laundry room and on the table?
This is.
It looks like your stuff, and I was like,
Would you do that?
you left it there for a few days.
Alright, well, you know what, I could do that, but
Do it.
I wanted to do more realistic. I was trying to impress you with my not that I would draw that, I would
All ready to get started? A couple announcements before we get started.
Like you're six.
Couple announcements before we get started. Today we're going to be talking about adaptive landscapes, and then I want to end with a little bit of discussion of the paper that you're going to be doing a literature summary on. So we'll have a little bit of time to talk about it. Remember, when you turn in your literature summary, we'll still have the in-class discussion for this one and the subsequent papers. I have, at the end of class today, I have exams to give back. And for those of you in my lab, I said I would give you guys feedback on the peer reviews. I'm most of the way through it, but not entirely done looking at everybody's peer reviews and comments. So I'll have those. So I'll have those for you guys on Thursday if you want to come by and pick them up. I'll also have them on Friday in class. If I don't get it back to you by Friday in class, I'll make sure to just scan them and get them to you as soon as possible.
I'm gonna go ahead and hand out ones that I have done, because I'll be finished by the end of the day today.
I'm hoping to be done by the end of the day today as well, but we'll see. Depends on the afternoon. So we'll get those back quickly. So we've got our literature summary for Brody and Brode 1990 coming up. We'll talk about that a little at the end. We've got our adaptive landscapes. We've got lab. Any other announcements? Any other questions about how things are going to go the last 2 weeks? Well, today we're going to be talking about adaptive landscapes and evolutionary constraints. Part of this comes from one of the papers in the series of papers by Brody and co-authors that helps understand the system overall. And we'll see a little bit of adaptive landscapes in the papers or references to adaptive landscapes in the papers that we read. We want to make sure you guys understand this stuff, in part because this is a classic example, literally a textbook example of predator-prey interactions, coevolution, adaptive landscapes, and evolutionary constraints that all ties in here. So this is kind of going to fill you in on one of the papers we're not going to read in the next few days. So let's start by laying out some learning objectives for this. By the end, you should be able to explain what an adaptive landscape is, how the metaphor works, what it means. You should have a general understanding of that, and how it relates to the direction and rate of evolutionary change, especially adaptation, or adaptation of a predator to a dangerous prey, as is the title of the paper. You guys already talked about G matrices on Monday, right? Did you see the G matrices on Monday?
Yep.
All right, so that's related here. And we're going to talk a little bit about how evolutionary constraints can come into being based on how selection might operate on two or more traits. In this case, we'll be thinking about the trait of speed and and checkeredness, or speed and resistance to tetrodotoxin. So, adaptive landscapes, what are they? I've got a few different text slides here, hopefully making studying easier for you all. But basically, it's a metaphor. And we've seen this already. It's this idea where you have hills and valleys and slopes that you can think of as kind of like a landscape in real life, but it's not a landscape at all. Elevation in an adaptive landscape is some measure of fitness that an organism has. And if that organism has high fitness, it scores high on an adaptive landscape. If it has low fitness, it scores low on an adaptive landscape. And the graph, as you'll see in a moment, relates some phenotype, or in some cases more than one phenotype, to fitness. That's the x and y axes of the graph of an adaptive landscape. Who can remind me what fitness means? Ability to survive and reproduce, lifetime reproductive potential or capacity, lifetime reproductive output is the outcome of living and reproducing over the course of your life. And there are several different ways that we can measure fitness. Sometimes it's hard to measure the lifetime reproductive output of an organism before it's lived its whole life. What's one of the most common measures of fitness that biologists use, that you guys have seen them use in this class? Instead of measuring how many offspring they have and how many grand offspring they have, what's a pretty easy thing to measure that relates pretty closely to fitness? Before you reproduce, you have to also survive. Good. All right. And what about adaptation? We talked a little bit before the break about what exactly we mean by adaptation in biology in this class. What kinds of things are adaptations? Oh, sure, that's an example, and there's pretty convincing evidence that that is an adaptation in the horn lizards from the young adult paper. But what makes an adaptation in an organism as the noun different from other features that an organism might have? Yeah.
It increases their fitness somehow?
Yeah, it should. That's a big part of it. Fitness consequences are one component of the kind of bigger answer I'm looking for. So can anyone add to what Sonia said? What are adaptations shaped by? What process are adaptations shaped by?
Natural selection.
Yeah, right. And so differential fitness consequences is a part of it, which is what Sonia was saying. Good. One key point here that I want you guys to keep in mind as we talk about these adaptive landscapes and we start showing you these images is that organisms have phenotypes, right? The fitness that those phenotypes confer is determined by the environment. So the real world environment, the biotic and abiotic factors that influence your survival and reproduction, or organisms' survival and reproduction, determine this mathematical fitness function. And as a result, organisms express some level of survival or some level of fitness. And that level is what gives us the topography of this adaptive landscape, the shape of this adaptive landscape. And when selection is really strong, you might have a really steep slope on your adaptive landscape. When it's weak, it might be more shallow. And the environment, of course, can change. If you're living in an environment as an organism and you've got a predator, and then your environment changes such that the predator is no longer there, that predator is no longer going to be a big influence on your lifetime fitness because you're not at risk of getting eaten by it anymore. So the environment can change or it can be static, but it's what determines the fitness of an organism. As Caden hinted just a moment ago, you guys have already seen these. Remind me, what's on the x-axis for this graph here? Do you remember from Young et al. What's on the x-axis? Residual horn length. Residual horn length, right. What kind of a trait is that? Is that a categorical trait or a quantitative trait? Or is it categorical or continuous, I guess is the way to ask the question.
Continuous.
Yeah, we don't have discrete categories with bar charts or something up here. It varies continuously from long horns to short horns relative to the body size of the lizard. Residual in this figure that I copied, they use the term relative, but yeah, residuals was used in the original paper. And then remind me what's on the y-axis. We already talked about this. Yeah, survival, probability of survival. That's why it ranges from 0 to 1 here. Oh, and we corrected the y-axis here. There's a typo there in the paper. So now we've got this fitness function. There's a function that describes this line. That's the fitness function. And you're looking at a picture of it. It's a graph. So it's a graphical representation of a fitness function, and we call that an adaptive landscape. It's just a slope with a plateau. What kind of selection does a slope like this probably represent? What kind of selection were these lizards experiencing as a result of predation by the strikes? You guys remember the 3 basic types of selection that we talked about, the 3 patterns?
It's either stabilizing or directional.
Stabilizing, directional. What was the other option?
Disruptive.
Disruptive, right. But if you've got, if having longer horns increases your probability of survival, what kind of selection does that sound like? Directional. Now there might be some limit here where horns can't get longer than a certain amount, certain length, some constraint, which we'll talk about. In that case, once the population moves such that the actual distribution of horn lengths is over here in the future, then we would expect it to be under stabilizing selection, if there's some upper limit. This was our example of stabilizing selection. You guys saw this on me, right, a few months ago? Yeah. So here we have a population that where fitness is low on one side, birth weight's really low, leads to low probability of survival, or even E51. And up here, above a certain birth weight, the probability of survival goes down. Of course, this was showing stabilizing selection in the 1950s, and that stabilizing selection is a little bit more relaxed now because small babies and large babies we can help them survive better now than we could in the 50s, so that's been relaxed a little bit, but this is a good example of stabilizing selection because we see that it's not just a linear slope, it's not just a mono. Here we've got a monotonically increasing pattern, right? It could be modeled as linear. Here, it's nonlinear, right? It should look kind of quadratic to you. So here are those 3 types that you all remembered. And what we've usually been doing, especially with the finch peak data, we were looking at distributions of traits in real populations. So some trait might be beak size, and then we have the number of birds with a certain beak size. A few with small beaks, a bunch with large beak or medium beaks, and a few with very large beaks. So these are how we detect evolutionary change. We look at changes in the average or the variance in a given trait. Average beak size or the variance in beak size. Those changes are what we see and interpret as evolutionary change. These kinds of changes occur when these organisms are living in an environment where there is a fitness function. Organisms differ in their fitness. And these are the shapes of these mathematical fitness functions that correspond to the resulting evolutionary change that you see here. If you've got a linear relationship like this one, this should look kind of like the lizards. So the result of this kind of a adaptive landscape is this kind of evolutionary change. So watch your y-axis, that's the key here. We're looking at the evolutionary response when we're actually measuring the traits. But when the y-axis is fitness, that's an adaptive landscape. Questions about that? What's the difference between an adaptive landscape and one of these plots of evolutionary change, or types of selection, response to selection? The y-axis. Yeah, fitness on the y-axis for an adaptive landscape, and frequency, or number of individuals on the y-axis for graph of selection. This one is maybe a little bit confusing, but don't let it confuse you. What matters here is that the variance is increasing and these extreme values are becoming more common, even though it's not really a binaural distribution in this graph, but that's the same kind of change. So it's just a visual representation of the covariation between phenotype and fitness. And so far I've shown you one phenotype at a time, one trait at a time. Selection acts on individuals. Individuals have fitness, but it's the distribution of phenotypes in nature that is the effect of selection. And that's what we describe in terms of changing means and variances, how the population has changed overall. So all that matters for an adaptive landscape really is that you have traits on the horizontal and fitness on the y-axis, here on the vertical axis. You can do this with more than one trait. And when you do it with two traits, the analogy to an adaptive landscape, or the analogy to a landscape, becomes a little clearer. So if you think of trait 1 and trait 2, and they have these values that are denoted by z, as two different attributes of an organism, two different phenotypes, together that combination might give the organism some fitness, depending on the environment that it lives in. So the height of this surface is determined by the fitness of these various trait combinations. And if you imagine taking something like this and looking down on it from above, so you're no longer seeing fitness as the vertical axis, it should look like a kind of map. What kind of map does this look like?
Elevation map.
An elevation map. What's another word for an elevation map? Any hikers or hunters out there? Yeah, elevation is right. There's another word for it as well. Yeah, topography, topo maps. So that's this landscape. It's not a real landscape. I know I keep saying that, but it's important to know that. The height on this landscape is fitness. In this case, we have two traits, and a larger value on either axis confers higher fitness. So the population moves up the fitness landscape. What this oval here represents is an initial population of organisms living in an environment, and then this slope, this surface here, is that fitness surface. So then a year goes by, selection acts on that population, and the survivors are the members of this smaller circle. So these are the ones that are going to reproduce to make the next generation, and probably the oval that represents their offspring will be a little further up this landscape. So they'll move towards the optimum. Here we have a situation where directional selection is also occurring in both traits, but it's going to approach some local optimum, some local peak on the adaptive landscape. And then the population is going to hang out right here, whereas in this case, directional selection will continue to push the population towards that peak up here until they're limited by you can only be so big anyway, or something like that. Yeah?
So the ovals are the strength of selection?
The difference between the ovals would be the strength of selection. So this is the population before selection, this is the population after selection, and then they go on to reproduce, and that should move the oval towards that optimum. Oh yeah, I put that note here just in case you look back at this, you try to remember. Dark gray is the population after one round of selection. That's also in the figure function. You can, there are animations that there are animations that might help you understand how this could work. If you have a population in an environment and the fitness landscape set by that environment is static, such that there are maybe 3 possible trait combinations of these 2 traits here that work really well in that environment, eventually your population is going to, well, as soon as selection is imposed, each round of selection and each new generation is going to move the average value of that population towards an optimum. It's going to move it up the fitness landscape. If these organisms are all reproducing with each other though, even as they vary in their traits, as we know populations do. Individuals vary in their traits. The genetic connectivity of this population is going to move the whole population towards one of these three peaks. It's possible in some cases to get polymorphic populations, but in a simple model, you would expect the population to move towards one of these adaptive peaks, and then the population will at that point be undergoing stabilizing selection. So here's your little, all these individuals, and as they blink in and out, that's them living their lives and reproducing. The new ones are blinking in at the next generation. Notice that initially, the population starts exploring both of these two adjacent peaks. About halfway through, you'll see that members of the population are on both sides. So we've got some with these trait combinations and some with these trait combinations, but eventually the population will move towards only one of those because of the genetic connectivity, the interbreeding of the members of that one population. If there was some sort of reproductive barrier between ones that were going up this peak and this peak, such that they're not exchanging genes anymore, then you might have a polymorphic population or two daughter species that have different trait combinations. What do you guys know about environments? Are environments generally static over time?
No, change.
Environments change. You saw this with the finch peaks. Different years have different rainfall. Different rainfall changes the availability of different kinds of seeds. And so some years the finches with larger beaks are strongly favored, and some years finches of all beaks are favored reasonably equally, so the average beak size moves around over time. This is a simple model of that kind of thing. Here we've got an adaptive peak over here, the environment changes, and now this combination of traits is actually better in that environment. So the population moves back and forth between these two peaks in the adaptive landscape. There's no speciation going on here. It's just response to selection over time, this thing we've been calling microevolution. But it is representing adaptation because it's natural selection that's moving the population averages towards those fitness peaks or those fitness maxima. When you have directional selection, you can usually model selection with a simple linear fitness function, that positive slope that I just showed you. It's also possible to have nonlinear selection. We saw that in the stabilizing selection plot of birth weight. You can have nonlinear selection on two traits that are interacting with each other. When that happens, all different kinds of, or a few different kinds of landscapes can appear, and one of them is this saddle. So here we've got a fitness landscape, you're looking down on it, trait 1 and trait 2, and fitness is coming out at you. And so we use these pluses and minuses to indicate the peaks and the valleys. Did you guys see peaks and valleys with pluses and minuses on Monday? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. Yeah, okay, good. So this should be review then. But here we've got fitness optima here and here, and so you might expect that if you start out with a population that has all possible combinations of traits, that the resulting population after a few rounds of selection will have a narrower distribution capturing those two fitness optima. So we've got this idea of fitness as the topography of the landscape, and populations respond to selection by moving towards those fitness optima, towards those peaks. But constraints can limit a population's ability to track fitness optima and to move towards those fitness peaks. So let's talk about constraints. If I say the word constraint without thinking about fitness landscapes, what do you guys think of? What does constraint mean to you? Yeah.
Something that limits something.
Yeah, okay, some sort of limitation. Anyone else have I see another hand? Same thing? Well, there are a few different ways of thinking about constraints, and one of them is a limitation that might come along with some sort of a trade-off. And that's the way we're going to be thinking about it primarily. You know, if you get better at one thing, you might not do so well at something else. So for each thing that you improve on, maybe there's some, you've only got so much time or energy or space or or just about anything where you can't always be good at everything all the time. You guys feel like that this semester? It's hard to be good at everything all of the time. And there's the famous supposed quote from Marie Antoinette, right? You can't have your cake on your table and then also eat it. Right? You can't do both. It's kind of a funny one, but I think this quote or this phrase is often used to colloquially to convey some image of you can't do both. There's some trade-off.
You can have cake on your table.
Oh yeah, but then yeah, this is why it's kind of funny, but not for long, right? If you eat it too, then you don't have cake left eventually. At least at my wife's house, the cake goes in about an hour, no matter how big it is. It goes real quick if it's out on the table.
Interestingly, they caught the Unabomber because of that phrase.
What?
Yeah, you told this story a couple of years ago.
You guys know the Unabomber?
No.
Yes. Yes.
Unabomber, math genius who went to live in a cabin in Montana and sent mail bombs to universities and airlines and things like this. He wrote a manifesto, and in it he wrote, "You can't eat your cake and have it too," which is evidently the original quote that was, back in, you said it's from Marie Antoinette.
That's incorrect actually. While you were talking, I realized that was the let them eat cake.
That was let them eat cake.
Yeah, which is the
So a
other-
long time ago, this was a phrase, and it was, you can't eat your cake and have it too, but over time, it had been shifted to you can't have your cake and eat it too, and only a person who had gone to graduate school and studied, deeper meanings of things would know that. It's a very peculiar phrase that not very many people in the world use that way anymore. He made it in his manifesto. One of his family members recognized that phrase in the manifesto and called the FBI and said, "I think the Unabomber might be my brother."
Yeah, brother. That's right.
Wow.
I would never stick with
That-
it.
Wow. That's awesome.
Language is important. We hear your voices.
Yeah,
in
voice.
writing.
Really?
Unabomber didn't know that.
Totally.
That's
All right, don't read that when you're writing. Secretary.
Have you guys?
Sorry, that was a useless aside.
Yeah, but
No,
it'll help you remember it, right? How about cost-benefit analyses? Have any of you guys heard of cost-benefit analyses?
Yeah.
You might have to do this at some point where you've only got so many resources and there's a few things that your organization might be able to do or a few things you might be able to renovate on your house and you want to know, well, which thing should I invest in that's going to give me the biggest return for my efforts? We do a cost-benefit analysis because there's a trade-off. If I spend my money on renovating the kitchen, I'm not going to have enough money to fix the foundation of the house or something like that. Maybe maybe fix the foundation before you redo the kitchen. But if you've only got so much money, you have to make a trade-off. So that's another way to think about this. Even Superman comes with a trade-off, right? Superman is one of the most overpowered superheroes in all the comic books, right? So what did they add to his character so that there's a reasonable trade-off and you can have the interesting stories and fun stories of Superman? Kryptonite, right? And you guys, you felt constraints? Excellent, which we just talked about a moment ago. When we're thinking about evolutionary constraints, we might think about morphological constraints, physiological constraints, or energetic constraints. In terms of morphology, there's only so many resources that are going to be allocated to development in the course of an organism's growth. There's only certain structures that you can make. You can't be, legged and legless, right? There's a few different ways of thinking about snakes. But you can't have all the shapes, right? So there are morphological constraints. There are physiological constraints that we're going to talk about, and then maybe more intuitively is energetic. You've only got so much energy for growth, for maintenance, for reproduction. So there are some constraints on how you allocate that energy to those various biological processes. And the physiological constraint example is the one you guys are reading about right now in the Brody paper. one of the classic reproductive constraints in all of biology, especially in animals, especially mammals, is the size-number trade-off. So there's only so much energy and effort that organisms can put towards offspring. And there's a few different ways that you can allocate those energy to give you different ecological strategies. And one of those is the size-number trade-off. You can have a lot of babies, you can have very few babies that are very large, or you can have a whole lot of very small babies. And most vertebrates fall somewhere along this line. Even great apes, chimps, orangutans, bonobos, gorillas, humans, even if you just plot us in that group, our group, with open circles, you can see that there's that negative slope that indicates a trade-off, a size-number trade-off. It also applies across all primates, which is monkeys and lemurs and things like that, in the closed circles, and then all mammals, we see the whole trait here. Now, different groups will have different intercepts, but what's important here is that the negative slope should indicate in your mind, oh, there's a trade-off going on.
So, Nathan, I don't keep up as much with plant literature. This is not nearly as clear in plants.
I was just about to ask if you guys can think of which other region of space can plants occupy that animals generally don't. So large animals tend to have low fertility rates, few babies over the course of a single reproductive bout, right? How many elephants have you heard of having triplets? Doesn't really happen, right? It's generally one. Even humans, it's generally one. And can you think of animals that are relatively small that have really large litters?
Rabbits?
Rabbits, yeah, nice callback. Dogs, sea turtles, right? You can think of organisms like that. So which region of space do you think plants can occupy that animals generally don't? What region in this space of kind of body size or organism mass and reproductive, yeah, top right. And you guys know the Sycamore Tree out front by the faculty parking lot?
I bet he has tons of babies.
Yeah. Cottonwoods, one of the most common trees around here.
Yeah, so
There's tiny little seeds with the little pappus, the little white fuzzies.
wait, so the bigger it gets, the more kids it can have.
So yeah, so trees, large trees that are early successional generally have small seeds. They can be very large and produce very many seeds in a single year.
Is that the body size of the adult or the body size of the offspring?
Oh, I was thinking about seed size. I think body size of the, well, what's 10 to the 6 kilograms? That's got to be adult, right? Yeah, that's got to be adult.
Looks like a
size.
whale. How much is a baby whale?
This would be a 1,000. This would be a ton, right? Right here, 10 to the 3. Of course, plants have also lack determinate growth. That's one of the major things. They get bigger and bigger as the longer they live, especially trees. So they actually start out reproductive. They become reproductive at a relatively small body size, and then continue to be reproductive until they become very large. So that indeterminate growth is part of what gives some plants access to this region of the space. There's another kind of constraint that we don't necessarily see outwardly as a phenotype that we could measure, like morphology or physiology. There's genetic constraints. And genetic constraints have to do with what combinations of traits might be possible for an organism to have based on the structure of the genome. And these can actually evolve, constraints can evolve following selection, given a certain adaptive landscape. I think we got a good, yeah, here we go. So you guys might remember when we had Mendel's laws. That was one of the questions on exam 1, I think, right? Mendel's law of independent assortment. It was that different genes assort differently into the into the gametes. So when you add those alleles into the gametes so you can draw your Punnett square or whatever else you're working on in genetics, all of that stuff we talked about is based on an assumption that the genes or the alleles that you're interested in tracking and predicting combinations of are on different chromosomes. So they assort independently. That's what his independent assortment was. And Mendel was just fortunate, or maybe strategic a little bit, in selecting traits that are on different chromosomes so they could all assort independently. When alleles for different traits are close together on the same chromosome, they're inherited together as though they're the same trait, or very, very closely so. The odds of a chromosome recombining and separating those traits is really low the closer two genes are on a chromosome. So traits that are specified by genes that are physically near each other on the genome, on the same chromosome, we call that linkage. Those are linked traits. So selection can favor putting genes for different traits that in combination are favorable close together on the genome so that they're inherited together. So if it's good to be resistant and resistant to tetrodotoxin, and also to be to have a certain behavior of hiding while you're shaking off the tetrodotoxin, then those traits might end up being close together on a genome, such that a parent that survives well is going to have offspring that survive well. So you can imagine a situation where you've got some Thamnophis snakes, right? And you've got a whole bunch of individuals. Each one of these points is an individual. And if you're over here, you're a snake that reverses often when you're being chased by a predator, or when you're moving, you might stop and reverse course and wait and then keep going frequently. That's one behavior. And over here, you're a snake that doesn't reverse. If there's something coming at you, you get away as fast as you can. So this is the move slow. This is the fast boy kind of snake behavior response. And you can measure that, that behavior continuously by just racing snakes and counting how often they reverse, or how rarely they reverse. You can also come up with a way to quantify stripedness. Are you more stripy or more checkered? So this could be the sort of the set of all possible combinations of these two continuous or quantitative traits. Now these organisms are in an environment, and that environment sets the fitness function, the adaptive landscape. And here we're dealing with two traits, so we get that nice topographic map model with an optimal range somewhere in this combination of not reversing very often, but being rather striped, and being less striped, more checkered, and reversing, having a frequent reversal behavior. So after a round of selection, these organisms that have low fitness are not going to contribute to the next generation. Then now we're representing a new generation. This is the offspring. There's another round of selection. Now these are the ones with the lowest fitness, and these are the ones with the higher fitness. So they're going to be the ones that reproduce and contribute their genes to the next generation. And so on. The population moves towards that fitness optimum, until eventually the population, maybe we could add points here, but eventually the population will all be around this fitness optimum. And then if you remove the adaptive landscape, what you see is a negative correlation between, or a negative relationship between stripedness and reversals. That's that relationship that should indicate in your mind, oh, there's a trade-off here. If you're fast, but you're reversing a lot, you're going to have low fitness, so that's not a good situation to be in. If you're more checkered and, if you're more checkered, but you move fast frequently, then you also have low fitness. Did you guys talk last Monday about why that is? Why if you're checkered, you're going to be more likely to be cryptic if you don't move? There it goes. So in this case, this correlation that indicates a trade-off is a result of several rounds of selection and evolution, adaptation to that fitness landscape imposed by the environment. You guys saw this at the end, right? Yeah. So here we've got the fitness landscape, and we're looking at it in 3 dimensions. It's important when you're looking at these graphs and a few others I'm going to show you in a moment to always pay careful attention to the axes, because in this case, this figure was plotted, I think, primarily to make it as easy to read as possible, given it's challenging to read a 3-dimensional graph on a paper, right? So down here in this corner closest to you is snakes that reverse frequently and are not very striped, so they're more checkered. So there's our checkered snake. So you'll see these snakes on all the next slides, even if the orientation of one of these axes flips around. But where do you see the peaks? Where are the highest points on this adaptive landscape in terms of trait combinations? Striped. And if you're striped, what's the other trait going to be to find the peak of the landscape? Yeah. Not very reversing, right? If you're striped, this is your peak. So if you're striped, we're going to go back here out on this axis until we find that fitness peak, right? And if you reverse frequently, where's the other peak? Yeah, more checkered, less striped. What's the worst combination? Really striped and what? Yeah, right. So this is really low fitness. This is lower fitness compared to those two, but this is clearly the worst combination. The combination with the lowest fitness. I don't need to use worst in case that gives you some sense of value. This snake is just as valuable as the other. It's just the worst combination for fitness. Here's another way to sort of think about that. Instead of trying to look at 2 traits at the same time, let's think about them one at a time. Here we have stripedness along the x-axis and fitness. But the shape of this one-dimensional, this landscape on this adaptive landscape using only 1 trait depends on the value for the other trait. So here are 4 different possible scores of reversal behavior. -1, 0, 2, and 4. -1, 0, 2, and 4. Okay? And depending on where you are in that reversal, on that reversal score, the fitness of your stripedness value changes. So in this case, where we've got high reversal behavior, the highest fitness is way over here with very low stripedness. And here we go to -1, where we've got very few reversals, and the highest fitness is having high stripedness. So you can imagine kind of moving through that adaptive landscape across the saddle that's formed in 2 dimensions. And here's that really low, really bad combination, right? The one you guys just looked at. I think you guys saw this with the pluses and minuses, or another version of this. Notice that reversals are flipped here, and we're looking down at the adaptive landscape this time. And this is from Brody, 1992, a paper that's came after the one that you guys are just reading. But I wanted to show you what this looks like. Brody went out and the team went out and collected a bunch of snakes, measured them, the test ran them on the tracks, scored their stripedness, and were able to plot them. And so this is all the snakes they found. Released them, and then used a recapture technique to estimate survival after a round of selection. So the snakes come from these hibernacula, right? Remember Paul's story about the snakes under his porch? So they would go get the snakes from the hibernacula, test them, release them, and then check to see which ones came back to the hibernacula next year. So here's before selection, and here's after selection. Let me show you one more time. Before selection, after selection. This is like the little gray circle, and then the dark gray circle inside. Notice that all the snakes that are up in this region with really low fitness are gone. The density of individuals on this kind of second low peak, second low valley in the saddle is much lower. See that change in density? But the ones that are up here survived, and these are the ones that are going to make a relatively large contribution to the next generation. So if their traits, that combination of traits is heritable, you're going to have snakes moving towards these peaks. The population moving towards those peaks. And if there's genetic mixing, then eventually it's going to pick one of these peaks. But if there's some reproductive isolation, if there's some limited genetic connectivity, then you might end up with a polymorphic population, or a population that varies along this kind of range of possible combinations. So then the question is, if you had to predict, using this adaptive landscape, which is one of the things adaptive landscapes can help you do, if you had to predict what the next generation would look like, what kind of a distribution of points would you expect? If these individuals have high fitness, and we let them reproduce, and then look at all their offspring, what's the new distribution of points going to look like?
Can you go out towards the top left?
Yeah, out here. So this is a region of relatively low fitness, very low fitness. These are your Optima. So you should be remembering that blue and red animation we just looked at a few minutes ago. So these adaptive landscapes can help you visualize selection in a population for one or more traits. And they allow you to make sort of the more intuitive predictions about what evolutionary responses might look like. And it just makes it easier to think about these things for some of us than looking at the actual mathematical function, especially when it's nonlinear and there's more than one trait. Okay, questions about adaptive landscapes? I want you to think about how this relates to the matrices you were looking at on Monday, and we'll continue to develop that connection on Friday. Yeah. Questions about adaptive landscapes? Any slides you want to go back or check? Seems okay? All right. So we have a little bit of time. I thought we might be useful for you all, since you're working on your literature summaries, to think for a moment about the 1990 paper. So do you guys have, yeah.
I just want to direct everybody to this week on the Moodle site. In this week's section of the Moodle site, there is a screencast on there that is me attempting to explain to you what they mean when they say residual resistance. So you can click on that. It will link you directly to the YouTube site, basically walking you through a dummy data set that I made up to demonstrate to you what residual resistance is. There's also a video on there that reviews for you. If you've seen it before, it reviews for you. If you have not seen it before, it tells you about how nerves function to create a nerve impulse, how sodium channels are involved in that. Next week, the materials that we're going to be reading deal with some techniques that you probably have never heard of before, things called patch clamping, which is a way that molecular cellular biologists use to test what's happening on the membrane of a cell. As you get into the deafening paper, which is for next Wednesday, they're going to mention patch clamping, so if you can view that video before you read that paper, that paper will make more sense to you. So there are a bunch of resources in these last 2 weeks that are external that it would be good for you to go and look at in trying to understand these papers as you read them. And so don't ignore the Moodle site for the next 2 weeks. There's stuff there that you put there for you that's good and helpful and useful, and you can go and take advantage of that.
That's an important point. I was going to ask you all, who knows what parturition means? You guys read that word in the Brody 1990 paper? Does anyone know what parturition means? You have to look it up while you're reading the paper, right? It means effectively it means birth, right? The process of birth. So these snakes don't lay eggs in the way that most snakes do. They give live birth. And so that's the term that's used here. So don't be afraid to just look up terms while you're reading if you don't know what they are. But because there's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff in the next week or so, we've added these resources that Paul was just directing you to on Moodle. So look up what patch knifing is, for example. All right. So I wanted to start by just asking you all if you have any specific questions that you'd like to talk about for the Brody 1990 paper. And, presumably you've all at least taken a look at it so far and been thinking about it. I came with some questions to ask you all, but I wanted to see if anyone has anything on the tip of their tongue who's urgently need help understanding.
Let's go. Go through the paper.
In your lab, we've asked you all to come up with a good analogy to help people understand the processes that you're investigating, the system you're investigating. Does anyone tell us what the arms race analogy is? Or what's an arms race outside? When you think of an arms race, what do you think of? If you think of anything.
Cold War.
Cold War, race to the moon.
Trying to
Yeah.
get best technology faster than other people.
Yeah. And so what's the analogy here in this system where we've got snakes and newts?
Predator-prey interaction.
It's a predator-prey interaction.
Where the prey becomes more deadly, but then the predator adapts off of how deadly the prey becomes to counter that.
Yeah. So it's this reciprocal selection. Each member of the interaction imposes selection on the other. But what did you guys learn about the strength of selection in predators versus prey, in normal predator-prey interaction?
Not only the strength of selection that the predator gives to the prey is more than the prey gives to the predator. If you die, that's a lot worse than this going hungry.
Than going hungry. That's that life dinner principle. So make sure you remember the life dinner principle that you learned about before Thanksgiving, because that's a fundamental piece of this, of why they chose this system.
Because in this system, it's no longer a life-dinner principle, it's what?
The lifeline.
It's a life-life principle, yeah.
Yeah.
Losing the interaction results in the predator losing its life and also the prey potentially losing its life. So the consequence is now the same for both species.
Good. So my next question was, how is this predator-prey interaction different? Which
Oh,
you
sorry.
said. No, that's good.
But
That's
I
good.
thought
I'm
the
just-
snakes just like threw it up.
They'll die.
So the snakes that have adapted to those newts, yeah, just throw it out. But if you were to take a snake from here in Missouri and feed it a newt, it would die.
And even the least resistant snakes in these populations are possibly killed by the most toxic newts in these populations. So I don't remember, is this in one of the papers or is this just from a conversation I've had with Butch? He tells a story of one day he found a dead garter snake and he put it in his snake bag, his pillowcase, so he could take it back and preserve it and also open it up and see what it had been eating. He continued with his field work. He gets back to his camp at the end of the day, he opens up the pillowcase, guess what he finds inside?
Live burgers.
The new
In live burgers.
No, he finds a dead garter snake, but he finds a live newt that crawled out the dead mouth of
Wow.
the snake.
Yeah, I think that was in the paper.
Yo, that's what's.
So they identified a system where there are dangerous prey and the predators can be killed by eating these dangerous prey. And of course, when the predator succeeds in capturing the prey and handling it and eating it and the prey dies, we've got this life-life interaction, right? Where you've got dangerous prey and the predators are dangerous to those prey items. So they've identified a system where they think this arms race could potentially be happening, where you could have reciprocal selection operating on both the predator and the prey at a more equal balance than a typical predator-prey interaction. There's a lot to investigate if you want to confirm that your expectations about this arms race are indeed what's playing out in nature. So in this paper, they identify the first step in evaluating whether this arms race they think is happening is in fact happening. What's that first step in evaluating a predator-prey arms race? This is kind of the setup to their the thing they actually investigate. What's the first step in establishing that in fact these organisms are experiencing reciprocal selection and as a result adapting to their enemies? What's that?
Seeing that the predators are evolving?
Seeing that the predators are evolving. Yeah. It's sort of easier and more intuitive to think about how the prey might evolve in response to the predator, and we see the newt toxicity, but how can we find out whether the snakes are adapting? We know that they die and have newts crawling out of them, right? And we know that some will avoid newts and eat slugs and worms instead in different areas. But how do we see if the snakes really are possibly adapting to these newts? That's the focus of the paper. It's step one in figuring out, is there really an arms race as we expect? So what's my next question? Oh yeah, what's an assay? Anyone find out what an assay is? They use the term a bioassay, but I just want to make sure you guys know what an assay is.
I know what the bioassay is. Not an assay.
So an assay is just any analytical technique you use to measure quality or concentration of some chemical or some response to it. So commonly used in the medical field, it's just an analytical technique. Now they developed the analytical technique involving living organisms to assay the effect of TTX. What's the bioassay here?
It's the locomotor performance before and after the injection of the TTX.
Yeah, so they're not actually measuring the quality of the TTX like you would find if you just Googled what is an assay and figured out what the first thing comes up. The thing they're actually looking at is locomotor performance. And they're using locomotor performance to understand the effect of TTX on the organisms, on the snakes. Why is locomotor performance a good assay for the effect of TTX? You could measure all kinds of things about the snake before and after.
TTX is a neurotoxin.
Yeah. It's a neurotoxin, and neurons are important in what functioning in the body.
Moving.
Yeah, moving, right? Muscles especially. One of the first things we did in this class was we talked about the 4 premises of natural selection as articulated by Darwin. Does anyone remember one of those 4 premises? So we've got some trait that's got to be heritable. What has to be heritable?
The trait with fitness
Yeah, some trait or traits that you're interested
consequences.
in. The differential fitness consequence, right? So those traits have to have some, confer some fitness consequences. What else was there? Why isn't everyone inherited the same number of fingers from their parents? Why isn't finger number evolving in humans?
No selection for it.
There might be some selection for it. I suppose you could imagine a situation where having 12 fingers or having 2 thumbs on each hand would give you better grip. And so you might have higher fitness if you had 2 thumbs.
Some people actually have 6.
Occasionally, yeah, but that generally isn't heritable.
Yeah,
If you have
sure.
polydactyly, that's generally not heritable, or has very, very low heritability. Everybody hold up your 10 fingers. How much variation is there in the class? In finger number? None, right? Finger number is just inherited. It's not variable, we need that variation. In fact, the way we've been measuring heritability using the regression requires there be some variation in the tree. That way of understanding heritability requires variation. So what's the first one up here?
Variation.
But didn't you used to have a figure for this?
I did, where we had one point in the middle of the plot, and then we used the line to show variation with the slope being the heritability. You guys have seen this before, but let's look at it in this way.
What would the graph heritability look like for this? Hmm?
So point right up.
What's the slope of the line through that point?
Undefined.
There isn't one actually.
Undefined.
It could be just as easily this as this. There is no heritability because there's no variation. You need variation in order to have a regression. This is not a regression, this is a point. It's a point on what was potentially a line, but there is no line because there is no variation.
And if there's no variation, we're not going to see any response to selection on this inherited trait. Even if, in fact, if you had 3 thumbs, you'd have the strongest group of anybody, you'd be just fine. In fact, and we see that, I don't know why I'm sticking with this one, but in birds, passerine birds, they have 1 digit back and 3 front. In parrots, it's 2 back and 2 front.
And woodpeckers.
And woodpeckers as well.
And
And then pandas have that extension that effectively acts like a thumb. And I
But
think
it's a different bone.
it's a different bone. And then koalas, instead of having the division here between the thumb and the other 4, koalas it's here. So they kind of do have 2 thumbs. Effective in terms of
That particular grip pattern is referred to as zygodactyl. The zygodactyl grip, and you tend to see it in birds that need to grip around stems or brace themselves against trees. And in mammals, you tend to see it in climbing species.
That's so cool.
Anatomy. An anatomy class.
Good. So which of Darwin's 4 premises did we not write up here? Overproduction of offspring. The one from Thomas Malthus, right? And really, it's just a lot easier to imagine how this might operate if you have overproduction of offspring, but it's not necessary. You can still have differential fitness consequences, even if the next generation is the same size as the generation before. Even if you were at carrying capacity, you could see perhaps differential fitness consequences, and the population could evolve. So I want you guys to think about which of these did they show explicitly in terms of the response of the snakes to the tetrodotoxin? Which of these did they show it probably operating, and are there any that they didn't show? I want you guys to be thinking about that stuff as you're reading this and writing the literature. Because that might lead you to think about what comes next.
I've been through all of my drafts from my lab except for Sonia and Amanda. So I'll have those for you by the end of the day today. Trevor.
Test.
Katie Bay.
See, I don't run this
Not it.
Oh, there you go. I keep looking for you back there.
Oh, yeah, well, normally I miss it.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you.
I was in my mind. Sadie.
Yeah, I put A for all of them, and A was never it.
Garrett. Wait,
Wait.
wait, whose did I?
This is Jamie.
This is Jamie's because you reviewed it. sorry.
I was like, wait, I did not write about that.
Well, it has your name on it.
So that's just not me.
I was like, I
This is yours.
don't like
I always do this. Jamie. Adeline. Now. On mine, I oftentimes found myself just writing at the top of your sheet. You got a really good reviewer, they said a lot of good things, pay attention to their comments, and then I only made comments where I needed to add things to it. If your professor and two of your peers are all commenting on the same thing, chances are that's something that you need to fix. So take that as it is.
There was a question on here on the exam about selection or evolution in response to high frequency or low frequency disturbance. And I just didn't get the answers I was expecting for a couple reasons, I think. So I went ahead and graded that one all in your favor. So if you see an X by that, but you don't have any points off for it, that's why that 3 free points for everybody.
There are oftentimes, well not often, but sometimes you write questions that are just really crappy questions. We will always grade that to your benefit and not to your detriment.
DSC.
I'm not sure.
I don't have my computer.
It sucks for you, doesn't it?
It's probably because I got one.
That is the way to go sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate that. We do have one in the back of our car. Yeah.
What?
In a cemetery.